Hey, what's up everyone, Danny here. It's no secret that I'm a fan of pre-built office computers. Myself, as well as plenty of other YouTubers out there, have shown that you can use them to slap together some pretty cheap budget gaming PCs. So when my friend Chris over at Upcycle Computer Works told me that he got a huge pallet of Dell towers in, and asked me if I wanted to make a video on one, I was definitely down to do so. So let's check it out. So pre-builds are pretty awesome. However, the ones that usually get the most love have i5s and i7s in them, especially from the Sandy and Ivy Bridge generation. The i3s from this generation, on the other hand, don't get as much love. We're in 2020 now, and it just sounds odd thinking about gaming on a 2-core processor. Well, the processor that we're actually going to be looking at in this video is just that, the 2-core i3-2120. Launching back in 2011, it's a 3.3 GHz processor that has no boosting, only 3 MB of L3 cache, but on the bright side, it does have hyper-threading, so at least we're working with 4 threads here. The system we're going to check out the i3-2120 with is the Dell Vostro 260. As I mentioned earlier, this is a system from Upcycle Computer Works. They're a company based in Chicago that sells refurbished computers, most of which are office-style pre-builts and laptops. I've worked with them in the past before, and they're good people. I'm all for their goal of repurposing computers and keeping them out of landfills, and their mission to keep prices as low as possible for their customers. So it goes without saying, I'm always up for working with them and helping to spread the word. I don't get any kickbacks from this, I don't get paid for promoting them, I get an inexpensive system to play with, they get some exposure, and you, the viewers, get some content to watch, and maybe a reputable place to buy a low-cost PC, whether it's for you or a loved one. So let's check out the system. These Vostro 260s have OEM written all over them. You've got a stock Dell OEM case, an OEM motherboard, an OEM CPU heatsink and fan, and an OEM 300 watt power supply. These come with 8 GB of DDR3 RAM and a 250 GB mechanical hard drive, and it does come with an optical drive if you're into that sort of thing. These pre-builds make for really good general use computers. Things like browsing the web, writing emails or documents, doing your homework and research on them. For those types of things, you can use this as it comes. There's nothing flashy about it, but it is a pretty good basis for a pretty cheap gaming PC, and I will show you how. So here's some potential upgrades you can do to this system. The first thing I'd recommend for any system, whether it's pre-built or custom pieced together, whether it's new or used, is to grab a solid state drive, at least 120 GB for the operating system, and then you can put some programs on there and maybe a small game or two. This can run you anywhere between $20 and $50 depending on the capacity that you go for, but it's going to be a noticeable quality of life upgrade that will make the system just feel snappier and newer overall. The next upgrade is the graphics card. They're graphics cards that don't draw too much power, and they can do so solely from the PCIe slot in the motherboard, meaning that you can still get by with the 300 watt unit that's already in the system. Some of the more popular ones that fit in this category are the GTX 750 Ti, 1050, 1050 Ti, 1650, and GT 1030. These graphics cards that are powered solely by the PCIe slot are probably going to be the more popular option for a lot of people, since you're not only saving money not having to upgrade the power supply, but these cards already pair well with the i3. I'm not going to do that, however, since I want to see what the 2120 is capable of. So what I'm going to do is throw in a better power supply, and thank you Dell for using standard connectors so that I don't have to deal with proprietary adapters or anything like that. And I'm going to throw in an RTX 2080 Super, which is a ridiculous pairing, and no one planning a realistic system should do this, but I just want to see how far you can really go with this i3 pre-built. So the first thing I did was replace the power supply. I put in a 600 watt EVGA unit and went to installing the 2080 Super. The issue was that it wasn't compatible, physically. It was too long and it was interfering with the hard drive cage. So, okay, this isn't going to be too big of a problem. These hard drive cages are riveted in, so I just have to drill it out at the attach points. So once the cage was sticking out, I installed the graphics card and I was good to go. Or so I thought. So I couldn't get the computer past the Dell splash screen, it just froze there, and this was not going as planned. And at this point, I'm thinking it's the power supply, since NVIDIA technically recommends a minimum of 650 watts, and I came short about 50 watts. And I thought it would be okay since that's just a manufacturer's recommendation, and the card is drawing nowhere near that much power during like boot up and idle. So, alright, it's not a big deal, I guess I'll just comply, and I pulled out a 750 watt power supply and hooked it up. So this should have fixed the problem, right? Nope, same issue, I couldn't get past the splash screen, so it's not the power supply. At this point, I have no idea what's going on. I know that each of the parts individually are working just fine, so it's not a problem with that, it's just a compatibility thing. So I thought to myself, Okay, maybe you don't need the RTX 20 Super in this system. I have a RTX 2060, which is plenty powerful enough to bottleneck the i3. And I've used it with a Dell OEM motherboard before that comes with Optiplexes, so I'll just throw that in and see if that works. So I did that, and again, no luck. It was the same issue. So I do a lot of digging around the internet, and sure enough, I find out that a lot of people have issues with RTX graphics cards on older systems, specifically on hardware that only use legacy BIOS and not UEFI. So there's my answer. It simply wasn't compatible with the motherboard, and it's not something that people typically have to deal with when they pair parts together that make sense and are within a few generations of each other. So I just kept moving down my list of graphics cards that I have on hand, and the RX 5700 was the next most powerful one I had, and I threw it in and it booted up right away with no problems. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Don't try to pair these RTX cards with like really old legacy BIOS systems. It's not going to work. It worked with the Dell Optiplex way back when I did it because those actually have UEFI. But if you're going to be reasonable about it, you should be fine since the GTX cards and apparently the AMD RX lineup works just fine. But the RX 5700 that I'm going to be using with the system should be plenty enough to bottleneck the i3. So let's actually look at some of those numbers now. First, we'll take a look at the Cinebench results. I tested both the older R15 version and the newer R20. The i3 2120 scored a 270 in the multi-core test in R15 and a bit over 600 in R20. This is pretty much on par with something like the Intel Pentium G4400 or a stock FX 4300 from AMD. Not the best performance now that we're in 2020, and if we were to compare it to something within the last few years, the Ryzen 5 1600 scores 12 to 1300 in Cinebench R15 and 2500 in R20 for reference. That's a 4x difference. Next up is ThreeMark Firestrike, and although this is primarily a graphics heavy test, the score I was interested in was the physics score, which is heavily CPU based. The i3 2120 scored 4296 in the physics portion, and again, for reference, the Ryzen 5 1600 scores in the ballpark of 15,000. So if we were to calculate a percentage based on these synthetic benchmarks, the i3 2120 performance pretty much comes in at 25% of the Ryzen 5 1600, which is a very popular modern day option and is considered to be very budget friendly. Just note that these benchmarks are synthetic benchmarks though, and that other tests or real world uses may see different performance ratios. These are just some repeatable and controlled ways to make comparisons that I typically use in my benchmarking suite. So synthetic CPU focused benchmarks aside, how does this processor game? It goes without saying that the i3 2120 is pegged at basically 100% usage or near that for almost all the upcoming tests. All the games were run in 1920 by 1080 resolution, and I was targeting an average of 60 FPS. I don't expect people to try to pair a sub $100 pre-built system like this with an expensive high refresh rate monitor, and 60 FPS is an acceptable experience for a lot of people on a tight budget, so I kept my expectations realistic. First up is League of Legends. Running at max settings, I was averaging close to 80 FPS with 1% low of around 60 and 0.1% low in the 50s. The i3 wasn't being pushed to 100%, but it was up there, and the RX 5700 was barely being utilized. League ran really smooth, and there's basically no noticeable frame drops that disrupted gameplay at all, but this is kind of to be expected with how old and light of a title League is. I'd say as long as the 1% lows don't ever fall below 30 FPS, then the gameplay experience will feel pretty smooth. The 0.1% lows can actually drop pretty low to around 20 FPS or so without having super noticeable effects on gameplay. It's just when the 0.1% lows start dropping into like the single digits, it's when the stuttering becomes very apparent. Next up is CSGO, which I played on low settings because I've been told in my comments section time and time again by viewers that it's what competitive players typically play at to get the best possible frame rate. You can see the settings that I used on screen, and with this I was getting over 100 FPS average with 1% and 0.1% lows that were far from anything that would cause disruption. The gameplay was super smooth, and this was as expected since this title is pretty old now. It released back in 2012, not too long after the i3 2120 actually came out. Rainbow Six Siege is another popular shooter, and at max settings, while running the built-in benchmarker, the system was getting over 100 FPS average with greater than 60 FPS, 1% and 0.1% lows. So far the system is doing really good. It's getting really acceptable numbers for a good gaming experience. Let's take a quick break from the shooters and jump over to some open world single player adventure games. The Witcher 3 is a 5-year-old game now, and you don't see it benchmarked as often these days when showcasing a system. It's actually a game that I used to always test, but I've taken it out of my benchmarking suite because it is getting a little dated. With that said though, it's still a pretty demanding title with its big open world, which at max graphics does still hold up pretty well today. With the graphics settings maxed out, I was fluctuating between 50 to 60 FPS on average, depending on how busy the scene was, with 1% lows in the 30s and 0.1% lows in the 20s, both of which were very acceptable for a smooth gaming experience. So it did pretty well on Witcher 3, let's see how it does on another open world game, the newer Assassin's Creed Odyssey. This is the hardest game to run in my current benchmarking suite. A combination of a huge open world sprawling with NPCs and good looking graphics is a recipe for low frame rates. Playing at the lowest preset, the system wasn't even able to hit 30 FPS average. The 1% and 0.1% lows were, well, low. This led to a less than ideal experience. Surprisingly, there was no noticeable stuttering during gameplay because the average FPS was consistently low enough to get your eyes used to it, so when the frames did dip to the low and mid 10s, it wasn't as big of a difference as say if you were playing like at 60 FPS average and saw those same 1 and 0.1% lows. Now let's get back to the shooters. Battle Royale games, the most popular genre at the moment. We'll start off with Fortnite. I was playing at low settings with max render distance for the most competitive advantage, and I was seeing an average right at the 60 FPS mark. The 1% lows were in the 20s, and the 0.1% lows were around 10, sometimes dropping below that. While the game was very playable, I could feel the frame drops. Like, I could visually see and know it was happening, though it didn't disrupt my gameplay. It was just noticeable since we were at a 60 FPS average, and I know some people are going to be a lot more sensitive to that than others, and it could affect them negatively during very intense gunfights. The best way to really know this is that if you already have a system that you're regularly gaming on, run some benchmarks during your usual gameplay and see what the frame drops are actually occurring, and if it's something that you notice or not. I'm speaking as a gamer that's more on the casual side. Everyone plays at different levels and has different tolerances to what their eyes can perceive, so just keep that in mind. Now if you aren't a fan of Fortnite and prefer Apex Legends instead, then I have good news for you because the i3-2120 does better here. I was playing at custom settings shown on the screen here, which would equate to roughly about medium settings, and was able to maintain above 60 FPS average, and 1 and 0.1% lows were in the 20s. It felt smooth and I didn't notice any of the frame drops had it not been, again, for the statistics being shown in the top left. Last on the list is the relatively new Call of Duty Warzone. I was playing at low settings and was seeing a consistent average above 60 FPS. 1% lows were above 30 and 0.1% lows stayed above 20. This was perfectly playable and I had no complaints, but you can really see here that the i3 is being pushed. So there you have it, the i3-2120 put through the gauntlet. To be honest, I was pretty impressed by it. It's 9 years old and it's still providing a very acceptable game experience with most of the titles I threw at it. What also makes it impressive is that it can be found on eBay for only $6. This is a $6 2-core processor that's almost a decade old, and it still has some fight left in it. Sure, it didn't do too well on Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and you're not going to be getting over 100 FPS average on all the games, but not everyone needs that. I know there are plenty of people out there, especially among my viewers from what I've seen in the comment section, people that don't even have a computer or only have something that's even more ancient than this that they can't even run any games on. You know, they could still enjoy a system like this. At the end of the day, I still stick by my opinion that pre-builds are fantastic options for saving money, especially if you're on a really tight budget. And I think they're really ideal for people out there that are newer to computers that aren't comfortable with piecing together individual parts and then troubleshooting potential problems that may come up, whether it be with compatibility or if parts come dead on arrival. Starting with a cheap pre-built can be a viable way to get into PCs. From there, you can get more hands-on, make some small upgrades here and there, and become more familiar and comfortable with handling computer parts. And if you're worried about upgrade path, since this platform is pretty old, I can confidently say that these towers still have room for improvement and they won't break the bank. You can upgrade to an i5 or an i7, which people are still using in this day and age and putting up pretty good numbers on modern games. And I know for a fact the i5-2400 would get better 1% and 0.1% lows on almost all the titles shown, and those cost less than $20 on eBay. I'll have links to the tower down in the description below in case you're interested in one. ECW has very fair prices for the specs compared to a lot of other sellers I've seen on the internet, and they've now baked in the cost of shipping to the lower 48 US into the list price, so what you see is what you'll pay. They've also got other systems on there, so definitely check them out, and if this particular system isn't for you, then maybe something else is. Anyway, that's gonna wrap it up for this video. Let me know your thoughts down below on the system and the i3-2120 overall. I want to thank UCW for teaming up with me on this, and I want to thank you all, as always, for supporting the channel and watching these videos. Hope everyone is staying safe out there with the coronavirus and everything. We're still, you know, kind of on self-isolation and self-quarantining. And I really need to get a haircut. I'm 3 weeks overdue. But you know what? We're gonna get through this. So, yeah, I look forward to seeing you down in the comments as well as in the next video. Bye.